Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC 74. In today's episode of my RC Scrappy build, I'm gonna guide you through all the build steps I did on the carbon cowling. The carbon cowling is the most exciting part on the whole plane. It was very complicated and took a lot of time to finish the shape like you can see it here. A little additional challenge was that Mike changed from a shorter version to a modified version, and I tried to build up my carbon cowling as close as possible to the modified version. I will go through all the attempts to make all the additional carbon parts which are glued onto the cowling and show you also all the mishaps, all the fails I had until I reached the result you can see now. So let's jump right into the build steps and have a closer look to all the details. To get a perfect fit on all additional parts on the cowling, I had to laminate the carbon fiber directly on the cowling. The first step was to put on some tape. I had to tape all the areas where I put on some air outlets or air intakes to make it possible to pull off the laminated carbon fiber part from the cowling without damaging the cowling. For easier working on the cowling, I had to remove the cowling from the fuselage, then draw all the shapes of the different air intakes and air outlets onto the tape areas of the fuselage. First I only did one side because I wanted to copy the exact same position onto the other side, and for this I used clear plastic foil, copied all the shapes of one side to the other side. For this I had to draw a center line underneath the cowling to make sure that I have the same position on each side with the drawn design of each air outlet and air intake. So I transferred the shape from the tape where I drawed it onto the cowling to the plastic foil, then cut out the shape of the air intakes and air outlets from one side, cut it out onto the foil, flipped the foil to the other side of the cowling, and like this I was sure that I have the exact same position on both sides. The first template I made was the top air intake of the cowling. I first sanded the raw shape out of XPS foam, then glued the XPS foam part onto the tape on the cowling. Had to make sure that it's really position centered to keep the dry carbon fiber on the template. I used 24-hour epoxy. Didn't mix in the usual 40% of hardener, but around 20% of hardener. Like this you have a really long time where the epoxy stays pretty sticky on the surface, and with a sticky surface you can put on the dry carbon fiber pretty easy, put it exactly in the right position, also into edges and corners. Like this you can let the epoxy dry, and after drying you have to put on the first layer of 24-hour epoxy to soak up the epoxy into the whole carbon fiber to make the carbon fiber part strong. Then I cut off some carbon fiber excess and pulled off the carbon part within the tape from the cowling and removed all the tape remains on the carbon part. After the first layer of epoxy, which is soaked up completely by the carbon fiber, you don't have a flat surface, a smooth surface of the carbon part, so you need to add around 4 layers of pure epoxy to get enough epoxy on the carbon fiber to sand the surface down to a smooth surface. Then I cut the raw shape of the part, sanded it down to the raw shape, and removed the foam template from the carbon fiber. This is a little bit of work just because it really sticks well on the carbon fiber part, because I used epoxy to put on the raw carbon fiber onto the template. So there is no wax or anything between the carbon fiber and the template. So that's a little bit of work, but in the end the result is pretty good. Then I used the Dremel to finalize the shape of the air intake. Next step was to make the templates of the air outlets. So first I had to copy the shape of the outlets onto the foam, then cut and sanded the foam into shape. And because I need two of the same outlets, I simply cut the foam in half. So like this you have two foam templates which have the exact same shape. Because the cowling is pretty round shaped on the area where the air outlets are mounted on the cowling, I had to sand a round curved shape into the flat area of the template, then glue it onto the cowling and sand it down to the final height of the template. Then it was time for the most tricky part of the air outlets. I had to file some angles into the template because full-scale Scrappy has some openings in these outlets which are angled, so the carbon fiber is angled from the inside to the outside. I tried it with filing the shape into the foam, took some raw carbon fiber, put some tape on it, draw the right shape on it, and cut the openings through the tape into the carbon fiber so the carbon fibers won't fall apart when I put the dry carbon fiber onto the template. Then I also put 24-hour epoxy, which is super slow drying, with 20% of hardener onto the template, put the carbon fiber on it and let it cure. So far it worked, but then I failed because when I wanted to push off the tape, the carbon fiber is not already soaked up with epoxy. So if you pull on the tape, you also pull off some loose carbon fiber, and like this I damaged the surface in a way that the part was really not usable. So I had to think about another solution for these parts. So the second attempt was to make flat air outlets which are not full scale, but in my opinion they look great too. And for this I cut out the shape of the air outlets into the tape on the cowling, drawed the shape of the air outlets onto the cowling directly, pulled off all the tape and put on some Vaseline on the whole area for these three air intakes, center outlet and the air outlet on both sides. Like this I was able to put on some dry carbon fiber all over the area for these three air outlets, soak up the whole carbon fiber with 24-hour epoxy, let it cure and pull off the whole carbon fiber part from the cowling. And all the parts already had the exact same shape like the cowling. To make sure that I will cut out the right part of the carbon fiber sheet I had to draw some guidelines onto the cowling to make sure that I can copy the exact position from the cowling onto the carbon fiber part, cut all the stuff out of the raw carbon fiber, and like this I was able to sand down the parts to the perfect shape which fit perfectly on the cowling. For these parts I also added a few layers of pure epoxy just to get the smooth surface and sanded all down to get a perfect looking carbon part. To get all the openings in these three carbon parts, I first drawed all the lines onto the parts, drilled the end points of the openings into the parts, and used my Dremel and a wide cutting disc to cut the openings into each part, and finally used the file to get the perfect clean shape of every opening. For the rear air outlets and the exhaust covers I used the same technique, so drawed all the shapes onto the cowling, made the templates out of foam and wrapped them with carbon fiber, pulled the parts off and sanded them down to the right shape. For the parts I used Vaseline to make it easier to pull them off the cowling. I used some dishwash cleaner and water and the brush to get off all the Vaseline from the carbon parts. After removing all the carbon parts from the cowling, there were some uneven spots on the cowling. It was time to sand down all the filler, and like this I have a final clean surface, and you can see all the bright spots, all the bright areas on the cowling, which were slight uneven spots on the surface of the carbon fiber, and with the filler I really get a perfectly smooth surface now. Next step was to make all the big openings into the cowling to make the carbon parts fit on the cowling. For this I first drilled some holes in all the corners of the areas where I had to cut out the shape. This made cutting the straight lines way easier because you don't need to cut any corners with your Dremel. Use the same drill solution for the round ends of the exhaust covers, then took the Dremel and cutting disc and cut all the parts out of the cowling. Then finalized the shape of the openings with a diamond coated file, which works perfectly to work on carbon fiber. Then first glued in the top air intake. For this I sanded the area of the air intake where I put on the epoxy, and also the inside of the cowling to get perfect sticky area for the epoxy. Used 10-minute epoxy just because it's not that liquid like 24-hour epoxy, and for such glue spots it's easier to work with 10-minute epoxy. Then glued in all the air outtakes and the exhaust covers. The front air outlets I only glued on with UHU Por. The reason for this is that I have to remove them again when I want to paint the parts, the carbon parts, because these three parts will be black and the cowling will be silver, so it's way easier to make a clean paint job with these parts separate. It's just put on to have a first look on the final shape of the whole cowling with all the parts on. Then it was finally time to screw on the cowling, and I think the result, it looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy so far. To make the carbon parts, which will be put onto the fuselage, which also Full-Scale Scrappy has, there is a cooling system in the back of the fuselage of Full-Scale Scrappy. These will be just for the look, so there won't be any big function. For this I wanted to avoid any damage on the fuselage while making these parts, so I shaped some foam blocks which had the same round shape like the fuselage. Then did the same technique again, sanded the templates for the carbon fiber parts, then put on some Vaseline this time to make it easier to remove the carbon fiber from the templates, soaked up the carbon parts with 24-hour epoxy, let it cure, pulled them off the templates and cut it and sanded them into shape. And then I did another try with some angled looking openings in the two rear carbon parts, which are these, but this try also went wrong. So what I did is I heated up the final carbon parts with a heat gun around 100 degrees. Like this, the carbon fiber is getting soft again, and with cutting the lines into the carbon fiber and reshape the template with angled openings, you can push a foam onto the carbon part while the carbon is hot and soft, and you push the cutted carbon part into the template. But in the end it didn't look great, so the angle was so minimal, so almost not visible. So I decided to go with the design you can see here now, and I really like the look. As already mentioned, it's not full scale, but I think these parts look cool too, and I will keep this design for this build. So this is it for today's video. I hope you like it. Next steps on the build will be about rudder and elevator. There will be some modifications too. So thanks a lot for watching. See you in the next one. Have a good time. Bye bye.